Edward the Blue Engine had just returned from the works after bravely stopping a runaway coal train, though not without severe damage to himself. His heroic act had earned him praise and admiration from all of the other engines, but Edward was not his usual cheerful self. His thoughts were clouded with worry and longing for his sister Molly and his friend Albert, whom he had lost touch with over the years. One morning in the yards, as Edward was deep in thought, a younger engine named Thomas passed by with a mischievous glint in his eye. Thomas, known for his cheekiness, couldn't resist teasing Edward.
"Cheer up, Edward! Did you lose your buffers in that runaway?"
He chortled, unaware of Edward's troubled state of mind. Edward sighed heavily, his eyes tinged with sadness. "Thomas, I wouldn't expect you to understand," he replied quietly. "There are things on my mind that go beyond a runaway." Thomas, taken aback by Edward's serious tone, felt a pang of guilt.
"I didn't mean to upset you, Edward. What's troubling you?"
Edward looked at Thomas with a mixture of sadness and longing. "I've been thinking about Molly, my twin sister, and Albert, an old friend. We were inseparable once, but life took us in different directions, I suppose. I haven't seen them in years, and I fear I may never know what became of them." Thomas, now more empathetic, softened his tone. "I'm sorry, Edward. I didn't realize. Have you tried asking the Fat Controller? Maybe he can help." Edward nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right, Thomas. Maybe it's time I seek some answers." Later that day, Edward found himself at Knapford Station, where the Fat Controller was overseeing operations. Gathering his courage, Edward approached him. "Sir, may I speak with you?" Edward asked respectfully. The Fat Controller turned to Edward with a warm smile. "Of course, Edward. What's on your mind?" Edward hesitated for a moment, then spoke earnestly. "Sir, I've been wondering about my sister Molly and our friend Albert. It's been so long since I've heard anything about them. Do you know what happened to them?" The Fat Controller's expression softened with understanding. "Edward, Molly and Albert, they were exceptional engines, you see. Molly was sold to a new owner who cherished her greatly. And Albert, if I recall correctly, ended up in a similar situation." Edward's heart leaped with hope. Do you know where they are now?" The Fat Controller paused thoughtfully. "I'm afraid I've lost track of them over the years, but I do know of a railway museum that's opening soon in Barrow. Perhaps you could find some answers there." Edward felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, sir. I'll go to Barrow and see if I can find any information about Molly and Albert." As Edward prepared to leave for Barrow, Thomas approached him tentatively.
"Edward, I'm sorry about teasing you earlier. I hope you find your sister and your friend."
Edward smiled gratefully at Thomas. "Thank you, Thomas. Your support means a great deal to me." With that, Edward set off to Barrow, determined to uncover the whereabouts of Molly and Albert. The journey was long and filled with anticipation. When he finally arrived at the museum, he was greeted by a friendly curator who was eager to share the history of the engines on display. "I'm looking for information about a twin sister named Molly and a tank engine named Albert," Edward explained eagerly. The curator's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, Molly and Albert, they're part of the original fleet here at Barrow. Molly was known for her resilience and strength, and Albert was a beloved favorite among the visitors. Edward's heart soared with relief. Are they still here? The curator nodded warmly. Yes, indeed. Molly and Albert have been lovingly preserved and are on display in the main hall. Edward followed the curator eagerly, his wheels clattering with excitement as they approached the main hall. Edward caught sight of two familiar shapes standing proudly side by side. Molly! Albert! Edward exclaimed joyously, tears of happiness welling up in his eyes. Molly, her paint gleaming in the museum's soft light, and Albert, with his familiar, kind smile, looked back at Edward with fond recognition.
Edward, is that real you?
Molly asked, her voice filled with disbelief and joy. Yes, it's me, Molly, Edward replied, overcome with emotion. I've missed you both so much. We missed you too, Edward, Albert said. The three engines reunited in the museum, sharing stories of their adventures and reminiscing about the old times they had spent together. Edward finally felt at peace, knowing that Molly and Albert were safe and happy. The story is by Richard Jordan, rewritten by Midlander, and told by WC Audio Stories. I hope you all enjoyed.